we'll eat today are foods that Native Americans taught to the English, the Spanish, the French when they arrived.
Have you ever heard of what the Native Americans' culture was, what they ate, and how they even prepared their food? If you haven't, then this is a very interesting and true story that you don't want to miss. Today on the Cook Menu, we are not cooking, but we are exploring the culture and the history of the Native Americans. Sit down and then enjoy.
In the past, meals for Native Americans were often as much about the ritual as they were about getting food. The Native Americans used what was around them in creative ways to get the most out of what the environment had to offer. And many of those recipes are still a part of their culture and daily life. So today, we're going to look at what Native American tribes in the Old West ate. But before we begin, make sure you're signed up for the Cook Menu. After that, would you be so kind as to leave a comment and tell us what other historical food topics you would like to hear about? In general, corn, beans, and squash were staple foods for Native American groups in the Old West. When it was available, they ate meat, fruit, and other vegetables. They could also eat things like roots and greens. The Native Americans ate a lot of foods that were high in fat, protein, and carbs. They often made sure their recipes were full of healthy ingredients to help them deal with the many hardships and problems that came with living in the Old West. On the other hand, not everything was hard. People also got together to celebrate and bond over food. Like in many other cultures, a good meal was seen as a way to bring people together and make them feel closer to each other. The traditional name for Navajo kneel-down bread, Nsai Joy, comes from how it looks after it is made. Corn, which was a main food for the Navajo, was used to make the bread. That corn would be ground up, then wrapped in corn husks and cooked by boiling or baking. Because the ends of the husk were tucked in or folded, the whole thing looked like the legs of a kneeling person. Kneel-down bread was soft when it was done, but it usually had a crispy crust. Kneel-down bread was sometimes given to medicine men as a gift or payment for their services. Elders of the tribe could also be given it. Kneel-down bread is sometimes called a Navajo tamale in some places, but this isn't a name that everyone agrees on. Pashofa was a dish that was made by mixing pork, corn, and water together. It took many hours to make. Pashofa, which could last for more than a month, was a soup that was almost always made in large amounts, because it was usually served to bring people in the Chickasaw community together. To make pashofa, corn was broken up and put into water that was already boiling. The mixture would then be stirred for a long time, which would soften the corn. When the corn was about half done, pork pieces were added. It was important to keep the corn from sticking to the pot, which meant that paddles were needed. People would pass down hickory or oak paddles from generation to generation so that they could stir pots of pashofa. The Chickasaw and Choctaw people also sometimes did something called the pashofa dance. This was a healing ritual. During the ritual, a medicine man would say a formula over a sick person to get rid of the illness, while others danced outside. In the afternoon, all of the dancers would eat pashofa before starting a second round of dancing. A tu is more of a general term for stew, soup, and mush than a specific meal. But a tu often had meat from wild animals, like rabbits. Stews, soups, and mushes usually had squash, corn, and potatoes along with vegetables like celery, onion, and wild spinach. As Native American tribes switched from hunting to raising animals, goat, cow, and sheep meat also started showing up in a tu. To make mutton a tu, the meat was cooked in a pan before being added to a pot of boiling water. After the vegetables were added, the mixture was cooked for a short time, and then more water and seasonings were added. Then there was more cooking time. And when it was finally served, it was usually served with bread or tortillas. Fry bread was another thing that was common among Navajo groups. It could be used for many things, and it was easy to make da dini ilgas. Most of the time, all you had to do was mix flour, milk, water, and shortening together. This means that Navajo fry bread was just unrisen dough fried in a pan. After the mixture was cooked on both sides, it could be topped with cheese, tomatoes, beans, or vegetables, among other things. When it was served this way, Navajo fry bread was a lot like a taco in many ways. The soups and stews called a tu were often served with the fry bread. But honey could also be used to make it more sweet. When Native American tribes were moved to reservations with poor farmland, they became more and more dependent on food rations from the U.S. government. Fry bread, on the other hand, was one of the few Native American foods that could be made with lard, flour, and other things that Native Americans could get. Wasna means, roughly, anything that is mixed together. And the Sioux people, who were made up of the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota, thought it was good for them both physically and spiritually. Legend has it that dried meat, fruit, and fat, which is what wasna is made of, kept the Sioux people alive. Wasna, which is sometimes called pemmican, was very valuable because it had a lot of calories and could keep warriors and hunters going for days. It's like Red Bull back in the Old West. Native Americans mixed beef, buffalo, or deer meat that had been dried with dried berries to make wasa. It was covered in kidney fat or lard that had been melted, and then was eaten with a spoon or by hand. Wasna used to be put in pouches or bladders, but now it is often made into balls, patties, or squares so that it can be carried easily. Wiwish was common among the Payamkacham, or Luiseños, as the Spanish called them. It was also associated with the Miwok, who lived in the northern part of the state. Wiwish was a stew made from acorns, which, as you may know, are the nuts that fall from oak trees and are very healthy. Well, you might not have known that they were very healthy, since there are more than 10 kinds of acorns in Northern California. Wiwish mixed a lot of different flavors and gave its eaters important fats, carbs, vitamins, and protein. Each fall, the first step in making Wiwish was to gather acorns. Once acorns were found, they were dried and put away until they were needed. Before making Wiwish, the acorn was split open and the kernels were taken from the shelves. Then, the acorns were peeled, and the kernels were ground into flour. The flour was mixed with water, leached to get rid of the bitter taste, and then cooked to make mush, bread, or stew. In the early 20th century, botanist and author Charles F. Saunders went to the American West. He ate some Wiwish, and in his writings, he talked about what it was like. Saunders says that the taste is rather flat, but with a hint of nuttiness that makes it very pleasing. Saunders went on to say that, based on his own experience with Wiwish, he would pronounce it about as good as an average breakfast food mush. Still, he noticed that cream, sugar, and a pinch of salt are things that non-indigenous people who eat the dish think are necessary. Wiwish was just one of many Native American dishes that used acorns. People from the Apache and Yavapai tribes also ate acorns. Archaeological evidence shows that people from the Pueblo tribes in the American Southwest drank a beer made from corn about 800 years ago. Today, however, Tiswin is more often linked to the Apache, who are a different group but had a lot of contact with the Pueblo. Test, who was an Apache and was with Geronimo when he gave up in 1886, said that making Tiswin was not too hard. She said that you just use a grinding stone or matati to make the corn fine. Then make a big fire and boil the cornmeal for 20 minutes. When it's done, you take it out and squeeze the mash to get the grounds out. Then you throw away the coffee grounds, take what's left, put it in a jar with yeast, and let it ferment for 24 hours. Test said that without yeast, the process of fermentation took longer. Often weeds and roots were added, and the process of grinding could be done more than once. For another kind of Tiswin, the mescal plant or other cacti were crushed, boiled, and left to ferment for several days or weeks. A lot of writing about the Apache tribe talks about Tiswin drunks, but members of the Apache tribe have said that the role of this alcohol in Apache society is mostly a myth. This is because the amount of alcohol in Tiswin was not very high. Victor Randall, a Muscalero Apache, once told historian Eve Ball that you have to drink a lot of Tiswin to get drunk. Randall says that most of the people who said they were drunk from Tiswin were really drunk from tequila or other hard liquors. The Hopi made a thin cornbread called piqui that was like Navajo paper bread. Blue or red corn was mixed with ash and water to make piqui. Even though the dough was usually thick, piqui was usually very fine and thin. Women would take handfuls of piqui dough and spread it out on a hot, flat stone. Once the piqui were done cooking, they could be folded, left flat, or rolled, and served with many different foods. Women learned how to make piqui by doing it over and over again for many years. And the piqui stone was kept in a small house or room that was usually used only for making piqui. Native Americans used hickory nut oil to cook and make medicines. This shows how important the hickory tree was to them. A drink could be made from crushed hickory nuts, but they could also be boiled, strained, and turned into what was called hickory milk. Kanu chi, or hickory nut soup, was a common dish made by Cherokee people. At the beginning of fall, women picked up fallen hickory nuts and let them dry for a few weeks. The nuts meat was taken out, ground up, and rolled into balls. After the balls had been kept for a while, they were put into a vat of boiling water. Once there were no more shell pieces in the mixture, Cherokee women added hominy and sometimes sugar or honey. Chokecherries, root flour, and sugar were all mixed together, brought to a boil, and thickened as needed to make wojepi. Wojepi was a common treat among the Sioux, especially the Dakota and Lakota who lived in South Dakota. It was thought to be sweet. Wojepi was sometimes eaten as pudding, but it could also be put on top of fried bread. Even though wojepi tastes sweet, it was not a dessert. Instead, it was one of many traditional meals. It is also kept for special occasions and served at ceremonies. The fact that chokecherries were used in the recipe showed how important wojepi was. In Wassa, these same berries were common and highly valued because they were good for your health. So, Isaac, this is how the Native American or what Native Americans actually lived.